Brought to you by Alman Auctions, the worldwide leader in antique tractor auctions.
In the year 1918, the Moline Plow Company released a new and improved tractor, the Model D. This tractor had many features that contrasted drastically to the previous models. Karl and Kent Jansen are tractor collectors and tractor restorers. They've worked on several different models of the Moline Universal Tractors, and they own Moline Universals themselves. We had them share some of the differences between the two early two-cylinder models and the later improved four-cylinder engine model.
Okay, I'm standing by a Model C Moline Universal Tractor. This is a two-cylinder opposed tractor. It has a lubricator for lubrication. It has crank start. It has a belt pulley in this area here. It's magneto equipped. Pretty primitive tractor. I would say not really so much as an antique as a almost goes in a prehistoric range. Not fast, got forward and reverse, got a pretty good clutch. If you don't have the transmission engaged, you don't have a brake. It's very difficult to belt up. It does have a belt pulley, but it's difficult to belt up. It's a little tricky to start. To crank it, you have 8 locations in your wheel, and you have to be lined up with that location, or otherwise the crank won't go in. It'll hit the spokes or hit the wheel or hit the brace. So it's a little bit primitive in that area, but they were somewhat reliable. Talked to several owners years ago, their grandpas, and the one guy, he wasn't too fond of it, but most people got along with it pretty good. With the lubricator, you would get a lot of oil running in the engine, and after so long, you'd have to stop and drain some of the excess oil off, and then you could probably refill the lubricator, and then you could go again for a while. So they weren't just all-day tractors. You'd have to stop occasionally and drain some oil out of the crankcase and add a little to the lubricator, but it was probably better than a horse because it would keep going a lot longer. And my brother Karl's sitting by a Model D. He's going to tell you about that, but it's an electric start, and we all know that electric start is for sissies, but we'll let him handle that.
The Moline D was the next generation up from the C, but in 1919, they came out with electric start, battery ignition. It also had electric lights so you could work at night. It had one up here so you could see forward, and it had one shining right down on your implement, which worked good. And the belt pulley was also lots handier. It was right up front, but it does run all the time, but it was still a little bit easier to get the belt on and off and lined up. It also has a regular, like we're going to call it the modern oil pump system, where you just put the oil in the crankcase and the oil pump just pumped it up, so you didn't ever have to worry about draining it down and such as that. Basically still had the same transmission, forward and reverse, but it did have individual brakes. So if you had hard turning, the brakes would help you turn, where on the C, you just had a brake that stopped most of the time. They have a differential lock, which was really, even modern, it took a long time for modern tractors to get all them, and that's a big deal, because if you had one spinning, you pulled the differential lock, pretty soon you was out of trouble. When they first was trying these out and testing them, they had a lot of trouble with them flipping and didn't have any traction on this side, and that's because these are offset and all the weight was on the left-hand side. So they, to come up with weight, they just decided to, it'd be quicker to pour concrete in there as to change a bunch of castings and material, and just went with simple cement. A lot of people don't paint them and keep them white, and we have one, and they always say, well, how come you put cement in the wheel? Well, that's just the way they come from the factory, and then it's kind of a unique feature because a lot of people have no idea that, tractors came out like that.
The B and the C came out in 1916. And here at the show, we're kind of noticing that about the mid-1918 is about the latest casting dates we can find on a Model C. So about 16 to about March, April, I'm going to guess, of 1918, they switched to the Model D.
Then they built the D for quite a few years. In 1918, the guy that bought that was probably a little bit disappointed when the neighbor brought the D home, because he had a lots easier going, lots easier starting, moving. handling and just easier to operate. I've always called them cultivator tractors because a lot of them did cultivate with them. And some of it's just because in our day today, everybody says, well, why would they build a tractor so silly? Well, everything that they used back then was horses, and your horsepower was in the front, so you drove it from the rear, and they all had implements that would attach to it. So that's why they liked these tractors, and that's why they sold a lot of them, because everybody had the implements already to go.
Now my uncles had a Model D, my great uncles had a Model D, and they followed the thrashing rig with a baler, a stationary baler, and they've used that for years and years and hadn't, as far as we've ever been told, that they've had really good luck with that. But now if you're operating one of these tractors, you kind of got to be prepared because they don't turn short. I mean, you'd have to, if you were cultivating, you'd probably have to skip a couple rows and then skip 2 rows and cultivate 2 and skip 2. They counted it earlier. There's from straight to turn to a 90. I thought he said was 18 cranks, so it's 18 cranks back to center, and then it's another 18 to go the other way. And it takes a pretty big circle to turn them, but it was still a big advantage over horses because you could just keep on going. And a lot of, they called it universal because, like Karl was saying, you could put a mower behind them, you could put a disc, you could use your previous, build your hitch and use your previous implements. But Moline actually built a lot of other implements for it. They, back here, they actually had a beet puller on display here that they would have used like in Colorado or someplace to pull sugar beets. The universal was a pretty common term with them because you could pretty much do anything you wanted with them.
They're trying to put the numbers together on the B and the C's, which is the 2 cylinders, and they very seldom to come to market. And when they do bring quite a bit more, just for the fact that there's just not very many out there. I would say between the B's and the C's, there's probably, if there's 30, would be a lot. And then the D's, I'm going to say there's every bit of 100 or more of them out there.
My uncles told me kind of an interesting story about these tractors. My great uncles, the one they owned was a D, and they pretty much balance if you take the cart off the back. So it's pretty light in the rear end. So they were told one time they had to be really careful when you pull it in the barn at night, especially if you're in, most didn't have concrete in their barn floors, so it would be a little damp. You pull in there with your lugs, and at night it would freeze. Well, then your lugs would be frozen to the ground where you get on a tractor and you'd start it up and you try to back up. Well, the lightness of the rear end of the tractor would come up off the ground, kind of like a tractor at a tractor pole where you're going, front end's coming up. Well, this is actually the back end coming up, but it was possible that you could slap your head on the ceiling of the barn. So you always had to put it in forward and pull the head a little bit. Then you could break that ice and break them wheels loose. Then you could back it up. And then the other problem would probably be with that really light rear end. If you were pulling a wagon that's any kind of weight on it going downhill, you would probably get pushed sideways. So I don't think going uphill would have been fine. Going downhill with these things with a load, with a cart, would have been extremely dangerous. But never heard anybody that ever got hurt. But there are no pictures or stories, but it certainly would have been tricky to go downhill with a loaded wagon.